Welcome to a new session of the Open Online Latin America Economic History course. Today, Ivan Luzardo Luna, a Barry postdoctoral fellow here at Penn, will present about the year of deglobalization and the import-substitution policies. Please, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Fernando. So let me share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Our topic for today would be deglobalization and the import substitution industrialization in Latin America. Let me start by saying that I think that this topic will deserve a complete course in economic history. And the reason is because the import substitution industrialization will shape Latin American economic history during the entire 20th century, or to be more precise, at least since the Great Depression onwards. So because that topic is relatively recent and have important policy implication, I think that is something that deserves to be analyzing in depth. Before I start properly with the lecture, I would like to bring your attention to the following two pictures. So I would like to contrast this picture with this one. And what we can see here, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but it's essentially the decline or the fall of the export-led growth era. And what we can see here is the rise and the consolidation of the new era that we call the import substitution industrialization era. So what we have here, so basically this is a saltpeter mine in the north of Chile. Today is a very important touristic attraction, so you can visit this place. But essentially, what you can see here is a ghost town. So basically, is a town that used to be quite dynamic. You have a lot of activity, and you can infer that the core of the economic activity in this place, but not just in this place, but also in Chile, was essentially the sporting sector, and particularly the nitrate or the saltpeter exportation. So the national economy in Chile was built around the saltpeter export. And when that industry went into decline during the interwar period, we will see the fall of that war and the rise of a new world where the sporting sector will be not anymore the core of the economic activity, but we will see the rise of the industrial sector. Even that we see industrialization here, an important characteristic that industrialization would have in Latin America is the focus of the market, in the sense that Latin American industrial sector will focus mainly on the internal market. So it would be oriented to exporting, it would be oriented to the world market, it would be essentially oriented to the internal market. And I wanted to illustrate the rise of that new world with this picture of the metal work in Monterrey in the north of Mexico. An important detail here is that you can notice that metal work closed in the 1980s, and as you can maybe infer, so we will see the collapse of this model, the import substitution industrialization, around the last decades of the 20th century. We will see the reasons behind the rise and the decline during this lecture, but just to have a better idea about which specific period we are talking about, I think that it's important to consider that not just this metal world, but many factories in Latin America, and more generally, the industrial sector went into decline in the late 80s. Another important detail is that you can see the foundation year. So you can see that metal works started his operation in 1900. And that is interesting because even that the import substitution industrialization, we usually think in that period, like the period that started after the the Great Depression. So you can notice that many of the industries that operated in Latin America during the 20th century actually started during the export-led growth period. So even that the sporting sector was the main sector in Latin America's economies in the late early 20th century, the surplus generated by the sporting sector allowed Latin America to move in resource into the emerging industrial sector. In addition to this picture, another important characteristic of the import-substitution industrialization era is not just the structural change, it's not just the decline of commodities, primary goods, and the rise of the industrial sector. Another important element here is that we are talking about a period of divergence. Unlike the export-led growth model, remember for our previous lecture, we mentioned how the economic growth propelled by the sporting sector allowed Latin America reducing his income gap with the industrialized economies. What we will see here in the 20th century is essentially just the opposite. We will see a divergence. So basically, what we will see is that the relative income per capita in almost all Latin American countries, except Venezuela, we will talk about Venezuela in 1 minute, essentially declined or didn't experience any major change. So what you have is that, for instance, in the case of Mexico or Colombia, so basically these countries experienced the same relative income per capita throughout the entire 20th century. We can see that in the case of Brazil, a more gradual growth or a more gradual convergence, both if we contrast Brazil with Venezuela, but it still is not enough to close his income gap with, in this case, with the US. So what we have here is the income per capita for several countries relative to that of the US. An important characteristic is that, another important point here is that we can see that that divergence process is more evident in these economies that did particularly well in the late 19th century. These economies are, of course, these economies these countries in the southern cone, so in the South or South America. Basically, we are talking about Argentina, Chile. We can also include Uruguay. These economies, as you remember, were very prosperous, so they have a good economic performance in the late 19th century, but for different reasons, they didn't experience the same growth in the 20th century. So they have a relatively bad 20th century. So that was the case of Argentina and Chile. As you can expect, so we have that Venezuela was an outlier. What is going on in Venezuela is that you have the rise and the consolidation of the oil industry. There are different reasons to explain that, but also it's important to consider that in the case of Venezuela, you have a relatively small population and a very profitable industry like oil was in the 20th century. So oil was the equivalent to coal during industrialization in the 19th century. So was the main source of energy during the 20th century. We can also contrast the evolution of income per capita in Latin America, not just relative to the US, that was the industrial leader of the world in the 20th century, but also to a country that could be representative of Western Europe. I think that a good country to make that comparison is France. And the reason because that is that we elaborate about when Latin America fall behind in our previous lecture. So we mentioned that that depends essentially which region are we using as a benchmark. So in the 19th century. So it's evident that income per capita in Latin America are substantially lower than that from the US. But what about if we compare Latin America, not with the US, but with Western Europe? Here, the story is a little bit more complicated because what we can see is that Latin America, even with all his problems in the 20th century, didn't do particularly bad relative to Western Europe. And the reason is, of course, the Second World War. So because Western Europe suffered the Second World War, so they have a relative economic divergence, I mean, relative to the US. So what we can see is that by 1948, Argentina still have an income per capita higher than that of France. So this is something that is interesting because the income gap that we observe today between Western Europe and Latin America, so it's evident. So we all know that the level of development, the income per capita between the two regions is substantial nowadays. So basically, that income per capita gap came from the second half of the 20th century. So it's interesting that we are talking about an economic divergence, but an economic divergence that is relatively recent in terms of, or in historical terms. So what we have is Latin America did very poor in the second half of the 20th century relative to Western Europe. And of course, in the case of Europe, of Western Europe, so this is the golden age of the European economic growth, basically the years following the Second World War. And we can contrast that evolution with the poor performance in the case of Latin America. Again, Venezuela is an outlier, but even in the case of Venezuela, we have an economic divergence after World War II. Okay, this is the outline for our lecture today. So basically, I'm going to break down this presentation in 4 parts. So initially, I would like to talk a little bit about deglobalization and 2 very important external shocks that Latin American economies will suffer during the interwar period. The shocks are, of course, the Great Depression and World War II. Then I would like to explore a little bit the theory behind the import-substitution industrialization. So basically, what the economic literature says about why in some specific circumstance that trade strategy could make sense. So why countries implement this kind of industrial policies. Next, I would like to match this theory with the Latin American case. So basically, I would like to explore the evolution of Latin American economy in the second half of the 20th century, and we can, until a certain extent, describe that period like a case study for the implementation of the import substitution strategy. And finally, the fourth and the final session for this presentation is the evolution of institutions in 3 countries, in the case of Mexico, Chile, and Colombia, and why institutions are relevant here. So why we need to consider institutions if we are talking about trade, if we are talking about economic growth. Well, because until certain extent, what we have in Latin America is an irregular evolution of institutions quality. What we'll have is that until certain extent, this work from the export-led growth period could be described like the era of the limited democracies, or what other people call the aristocratic republics. Basically, you have some level of democracy, but quite limited. And what we will see is the collapse of that kind of political regimes, and the rise and the consolidation of new political regimes. So until a certain extent, this transition is the inability of the aristocratic republics to make reforms and to build a more inclusive economic institutions. So basically, just to summarize what I'm going to say in the last part of this presentation is that the limited democracies or these aristocratic republics proper from the late 19th century, so they were successful in centralizing the political power, basically in moving away from these political disorders proper from the caudillos era in the early 19th century, but they failed in reforming and open the benefits of economic growth to a wider segment of the population. So basically, if you want, so they file it in redistribution. So basically, that would be how we can describe this. Okay, so let's start by our first topic, the globalization and the Great Depression. So let me start with a more general overview about what was going on in this period. So what we have at a global level is that the global economy moved from the first wave of globalization that we can basically allocate in the late 19th century up to 1914. So we'll see that the global economy, particularly North America and Western Europe, moved into the era of deglobalization. As I mentioned last week, deglobalization in Latin America didn't start in 1914, and the reason was because the role that Britain used to have in providing capital inflows, importing commodities from Latin America was replaced until a certain extent by the US. So the globalization in the particular case of Latin America started after the Great Depression, when we will see the rise of protectionism. So we have the globalization process going on at a global level. So we have a decline in international trade that would be very problematic for Latin American countries. Why? Because the sense, the core of the export growth model is, as we can see, essentially the exporting sector. So if you have no markets to export anymore, so that will lead to a collapse of that model. But the globalization would be not just an interruption to international trade. So what we have also is a lot of macroeconomic instability. And one of the reasons why we will have a lot of macroeconomic problems is because Latin American countries rely on capital inflows, not just for investment, for instance, in transportation or in other infrastructure, but also to funding government's expenditure. So basically, external debt is an issue here, and if you have a sudden stop in capital inflows, so that will exposure public finance to a very complicated situation. So what we have is like what similar to what happened in the early 19th century in the 1820s after the independence period, that essentially all countries in Latin America went into default. So they didn't have the ability to continue repaying their external debts. We have an exception here that that's the case of Argentina, that Argentina wanted to preserve its credibility and wanting to maintain his access to international capital markets, but eventually even Argentina went into default. So we have that. This is the general picture. So we have the globalization at the global level. But what is interesting in the case of Latin America is that the globalization would have long-lasting consequences, long-lasting implications in the case of Latin America. And what we will see is a change of era. It's not just that we are suffering to major external shocks, that we saw a reduction in capital inflows, that we saw a decline in commodity prices that would have very important implications, and that would be the change of the transition from the exponential growth era to the inward-looking industrialization that basically will remain in Latin America at least up to the 1990s. So something interesting about again about Latin America is that usually we associate the interwar period with the globalization, basically because after World War II, Western Europe, North America, and several countries across the world moved into a new era of globalization. But until a certain extent, what happened in Latin America during the 20th century is that some of the characteristics proper from the interwar period remained in operation during the second half of the 20th century. So until a certain extent, Latin America remained in the interwar period up to the late 20th century. Also, it's important to consider not just external elements, not just exogenous exogenous impacts here, like the declining international trade, not just exogenous factors, but also endogenous factors here, or endogenous elements, like structural change that were going on in Latin America. So by the early 20th century, so we have a rise in urbanization. So we are not talking anymore about societies composed mainly by peasants or by an agricultural world. So we have a rise in the urbanization rate. A substantial part of that urbanization is occurring in cities that were not prepared to receive all that population that were coming from the countryside. So I will see in the early 20th centuries is the rise of urban poverty. We'll see the rise of slums and people, the newcomers, people in cities were living in very precarious conditions. And of course, all that have implications in the social tensions that we can see in this period. Also, you have the rise of unions, and in a more general way, what you have is the rise of working, the middle and working classes. So you have a more diverse society, and there was a demand for change and for redistribution. So this is an important point. Why? Because until certain extent, the collapse of the aristocratic republics is quite related with the demand for redistribution, and that demand for redistribution is quite associated with the rise and the consolidation of the middle and working classes. And also is quite related with the with urban poverty, with the high urban poverty. For instance, in the case of Chile, the collapse of the parliamentary regime is quite associated with the fact that that regime didn't approve a lot of demands for improving labor conditions. So you have that an increasing pressure from working classes to redistribution that couldn't be implemented by this political regime from proper from the late 19th century. We have an important precedent here to consider, the Mexican Revolution, that where you can see several of these elements. So you have a higher level of urbanization. So you have all the problem of the demand for a more inclusive political regime. And something also that is important in the case of Mexico is that the political transition occurred before the globalization. And some people suspect that that would be a reason why Mexico would implement a milder version of the import substitution industrialization, in the sense that, for instance, Mexico would implement capital controls and the more extreme policies that were implemented, for instance, in the southern countries like Argentina or Chile. Okay, now let's see the magnitude, the size of the Great Depression in Latin America. An initial measurement that would be interesting here is the impact of the Great Depression on the GDP, on the income per capita. Of course, we wanted to see this not just for one specific year, but to a number of years that could be representative of the shock and the recovery from that initial external shock. So I would say that the evolution of the income per capita between 1929 and 1933 would be a good period. Why? Because the worst years of the depression for Latin American countries was in 1932. So in 1932, so we see the extent of the recovery. I thought that is important here is to consider the magnitude of the fall that the Great Depression mean in Latin America. So see, for instance, the case of Chile. So Chile saw an income decline over 35%. So that fall in his income per capita is even higher than that of the US. So the US is the core of the Great Depression, so is one of the countries where the Great Depression have its highest impact. And even with all the literature, all the relevance that that the Great Depression have in the US, so we have another country where the magnitude of the depression was even higher than that country is Chile. So you have that the fall in his income per capita was substantially large in the case of Chile. Also, even that fall was not in the same intensity in the case of other countries in Latin America. In any case, so we are seeing here a decline in the GDP over 15% in most of the case. Consider, for instance, that in the case of Germany, that we know all the implications that external shock have on the German economy and his implications. So we have in most of the cases in Latin America is that the magnitude of the fall in the GDP is even higher than that of Germany and probably from many countries in Central Europe. So we usually think in the Great Depression like a major financial crisis that have its highest impact in North America and Central Europe. And what we have in Latin America is that we have some countries that suffered even more in terms of his decline in income per capita. So the first point is that the magnitude of this external shock is substantial, and of course that we have important implications. So one of the areas where we can see the long-lasting impact of the Great Depression in Latin American economies is in the decline of the relevance of the sporting sector. So we see that exports as a share of the GDP saw an important reduction during the 1930s. So see, for instance, the case of Argentina. So in the case of Argentina, in the year before the depression, so in 1928, exports accounted approximately for the 30% of the Argentina GDP. By the end of the 1930s, meaning 1938, we can see that exports accounted for less than the 20% of the Argentina GDP. So what that means is that the external sector saw an important decline in its relevance for economies in Latin America. So something similar happened in the case of Chile. So as I mentioned before, so Venezuela is an outlier, so it's a special case. What is explaining Venezuela particular condition is oil, of course. But in most of cases, what we have is relative decline in exports as share of the GDP. We have also the particular case of Colombia and Brazil in the 1930s, where the export sector, the exporting sector didn't see the same level of decline, and this is related with the kind of commodity that these economies are exporting. So what is going here in the case of Colombia and Brazil is that coffee is the most relevant commodity for these economies. And in the 1930s, both countries reached an agreement with the US to supply coffee. So we have the Pan American Coffee Agreement that was enforced in the 30s and in beyond, and that explains why the sporting sector in these countries didn't see the same level of decline. But in general terms, so in more competitive markets, so we saw that in general the sporting sector saw a decline throughout the 1930s. That decline in the relevance of the sporting sector is of course associated with the decline or the depression in commodity price in international markets. We can see here the magnitude of that decline. For instance, in the case of Argentina, in 1932, again, so this is the worst year of the depression. The weighted average of his export prices was just 37% of the level reached in 1928. I mean, if we contrast how smaller export prices were in the worst years of the depression relative to the year previous to the depression, so we can see here is again a mass decline. So this is something that is really a depression. So this is why it was quite difficult for these countries didn't implement any change or any adjustment to that major external shock. We saw similar declines, similar reduction in prices for other countries in Latin America. Again, Venezuela is an outlier here, but even in Venezuela, so there was a reduction in oil prices, but of course that was compensated by an increase in quantities. We saw not just a decline in export prices, but also a decline in the terms of trade. So that means that it was not just more difficult boosting Latin American economies via promoting international trade, via promoting the sporting sector, but also it was more complicated to compensate the losses from the export sector with, I mean, it was more complicated also to import because we see we see a deterioration in the terms of trade. So it was not just that we have a depression in export prices, what we have here is also a deterioration in the terms of trade. So it was also more complicated for Latin American countries to continue having access to manufacturers and to all these imports that were very common during the export growth era. So we saw here also a deterioration in the terms of trade. So the Great Depression, a major external shock, first area where we can see that impact is international trade. But of course, this is not just about trade, this is also about capital flows and about financial integration. What we have in this figure is the evolution of capital inflows to Latin America, how relevant Britain and the US were. This is what we mentioned before. So until certain extent, the deglobalization period in Latin America started after the Great Depression because that important role that Britain used to have in the late 19th century was replaced by the U.S. during the 1920s. So what we have is that in the case of Latin America, in terms of capital inflows, we see an extension of the so-called roaring 20s in the U.S. Economic history. Of course, that came into an end after the Depression, and we saw not just a decline in capital inflows, but also capital outflows. So it's not just that less capital was coming into Latin America, it's also that capital was moving away from Latin America. And that was one of the reasons because you have problems in the exchange rate, so currencies depreciated very much during this period, and of course that is related with default on external debt. This is a figure from a very influential article by Reinhardt and Rogoff that they basically they mapped the number of crises in Latin America, in Latin America's history. And what is important here, I mean, what is the figure display is the number of countries in a financial crisis for a given year. So what we have is that, for instance, in 1826, we have 13 countries in suffering a financial crisis. We can see that the number of countries that we can class it into the category that countries that were suffering a financial crisis after the Depression was 16, essentially almost all countries in Latin America. So not just a decline in his income per capita, a decline in his GDP. They were not just suffering a recession, but also they were under a major financial crisis. So this is what we can see here. And a level similar to that was only observed in the late 1980s. That will be another topic in this course about the so-called the lost decade in Latin America. That is the way how several scholars have labeled it the sovereign debt crisis from the 80s. Okay, so the Great Depression led into a major financial crisis. What is also interesting in this article by Reinhardt and Rogoff is that they mapped not just the number of countries in crisis for every year since the early 19th century, but also the kind of crisis, the nature of the crisis. So what kind of crisis are we talking about? And what we can see here is that the problem in the case of the financial crisis that we're suffering in Latin America in the with the Great Depression was essentially a crisis in countries' external debt. So we have sovereign debt crisis that unfortunately have been very prevalent in Latin American economic history. And also we have a crisis in the exchange rate. So what we have is a depreciation or a strong depreciation in Latin American currencies. This is why we can class it, this financial crisis in a currency, but mainly an external debt crisis. So what happened is that Latin America moved again into a vicious cycle that because an external shock went into default, and because countries were into default, they couldn't have access to fresh loans. So you have that all these forces were self-reinforcing, and basically that is, I mean, considering the difference and context, but until certain extent, something similar to what was going on in the early 19th century. So, but basically, government finance depended very much on new loans or in French loans, and once they lost the ability to repay, so they moved into default, and it's more complicated to have access to new loans, and it's like a vicious cycle. Okay, so what we have is so zooming on, summarizing what we have in the Great Depression in Latin America: a major external shock, a deterioration in international trade, and also a deterioration in Latin America financial integration via a major sovereign debt crisis. So the next question that we wanted to answer is, why was Latin America hit hard by the Great Depression? So why the Great Depression have a major impact on that continent? And the reason, as you can anticipate, is because until then, exporting was essentially the main engine of economic growth. So basically, the exporting sector was was generating the surpluses necessary to, for instance, developing the early stage of industrialization, and to provide government necessary revenues to their regular operation. So international trade was particularly relevant for these economies that at that point also have relatively small internal markets. So if you have an interruption in international trade, so of course that would have a major impact on Latin America. Also, because the government revenues, because all the points that we mentioned in the previous lecture about how difficult have been in the case of Latin America, building state capacity and building government ability to find a stable source of revenues. So they depend very much of custom and duties rather than, for instance, alternative source of income like income taxes or other kind of taxes. So international trade was not just relevant for the private sector, but also was relevant for government finance, because a substantial share of government incomes came from customs and duties, basically taxes on international trade. Also because of course capital inflows. So basically, in general terms, Latin American economies were quite dependent on his integration into the world economy, and the collapse of globalization, of course, have a major impact on those economies. So also we wanted to know is, how did Latin America manage the Great Depression? So wanted to see how was the management of the crisis itself, and also we will see the evolution of the recovery of Latin America in the aftermath of the Depression. So initially, countries reacted in a very conservative way. So policymakers were very aware that they they were doing relatively well in the during the export growth period, so they didn't want to lose their access to international capital markets, or they didn't want to lose their access to foreign markets in terms of international trade. So there was an initial orthodox reaction, but gradually the magnitude of the crisis and the circumstance led to policymakers to move it away from that initial conservative approach. And what we will see throughout the 30s is a new round of sovereign debt defaults. Also, we'll see an increase in protectionism. We will see the rise of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So it will be more complicated. For instance, importing in Latin America. And also it's because if the external sector is not anymore the 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 area or is not anymore what is boosting Latin America economic activity. So basically, the only remaining option for these countries was their internal market. So basically, it was a matter of survival in this stage of the depression. So we'll see a move away from the orthodox economic policy. So countries will implement different exchange rates, and they will implement also expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Basically, they try to implement counter-cyclical policies in order to mitigate the crisis. That will be just the first round of policies implemented to managing the depression. We will see that the level of government intervention in the economy will increase into a new level. And we will see that it was not just about implementing counter-cyclical policies. What we'll see is that the level of intervention increased, and for instance, countries started to implement capital controls. And also the so-called financial repression. So what is financial repression? Basically is forced loans. So government have an important fiscal deficit that they need to cover, and basically ask it to the banking sector to lend that money to the government. So it is basically an increase in government control on the pool of saving that our economy have. So we will see an increase in financial repression, and also we will see that government intervene not just in managing saving, but also in allocating that saving via preferential loans. So we will see the rise and the consolidation of development banks or development banking in Latin America. And in some countries, we will see an additional level of government intervention, and even the implementation of the so-called unorthodox policies. Essentially, we're talking about price controls. They were more prevalent in South America, or particularly in the southern cone. So, for instance, we have the cases of Argentina and Chile. So let's see, for instance, the evolution of the money supply. Basically, here what we can see is how countries moved away from the orthodox policy in the sense that they adopted expansionary money policies, but notice that that occurred essentially in the early 30s. That was not their initial reaction. So countries expanded the money supply when they realized that the Great Depression would be long-lasting. So initially, they wanted to continue with the same model, so they have no incentive or policymakers have no clear incentive to change their traditional approach to economic management. But eventually, when they realized that that would be just no a random financial crisis, or it would be not just a banking panic from these that many that occurred during the 19th century. So they moved away from that orthodox approach and expanded the money supply. We'll see that the country that persisted most in maintaining the gold standard and restricted the increase in his money supply was Argentina. That could be maybe because Argentina saw this substantial economic expansion during the export growth period, and probably have more incentive to try to preserve that model. We will see also the adoption of capital controls in Latin America. So countries eventually in the early 30s implemented capital controls. But something that is interesting here is that several countries didn't implement capital controls. So to be more precise, so what you have is the larger economies in Latin America implemented capital controls, but what you have is that relatively small economies that were probably more relied more on the external sector didn't implement that. But an exception in the group of the large economies in Latin America is the case of Mexico. So Mexico didn't implement capital controls like large economies in South America, and probably the reason is because I mean, Mexico is very close to the US, and it was very difficult to enforce that policy with that large border. Also, we will see, I mean, in this line of financial repression and a higher level of intervention on the financial sector, we will see the rise and the consolidation of development banks in Latin America. So we will see, for instance, the foundation of Nacional Financiera in the case of Mexico in the early 30s. This kind of developing banking started to be more popular across the whole continent. In the case of Chile, you have Corfo in 1939, similar the Instituto de Fomento Industrial in the case of Colombia, and after the Second World War, Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimiento Económico y Social in the case of Brazil. But the reason, because I wanted to highlight the rise and the consolidation of development banks in Latin America, is because when we are talking about the import-substitution industrialization period, we usually associate that with protectionism in international trade. So my point here is that what you have here is more than just protectionism. It's just, I mean, it's more than a tariff, non-tariff barriers. So it's a higher level of government intervention on the economy. And one of the areas that has been less explored on this period is government intervention on the financial sector. So basically, government have an important power to allocate credit, and we can associate that with the fact that the government considered that some industries were strategic, and of course there was a bias in favor of the industrial sector. So this is just very briefly the implementation of price controls in the case of Chile. So that was implemented very early during the 1930s. So the institution that managed prices in Chile was the Comisariato de Precios. It was like the agency that basically set the prices for these goods that were under price controls. Okay, so why countries gradually started to, so we saw how governments managed the depression. Now let's see how Latin American economies recovered from the depression. And what we can see in this table is essentially we can decompose the source of economic growth. So basically, we know that economic growth is essentially how the GDP evolves, and we wanted to break down the forces or the reason behind that economic growth. And this is what this table did. Basically, we can decompose the sort of economic growth in three main sources in the internal sector, the home final demand, the reduction in imports, so change in the import coefficient, and the rise of the export sector. We can call this the export promotion. And what is interesting here is that in the 1930s, the main source of economic growth is the internal markets. So economies in Latin America were able to overcome the depression because they saw an expansion of the internal markets. And that would explain why countries were so hesitant during the second wave of globalization in departing from this already in a more interventionist approach to the economy and resuming the export-led growth model. So basically, there was an important precedent here, and it was the fact that internal markets started to become more important than the export sector, and now final demand and internal markets were, were the place where opportunities for profits were. That will also have implications um, in the interest group and in the economic elite in their approach or in the support toward the import substitution industrialization period. Finally, something I wanted to say is that that major economic shock that the Great Depression was have also not only economic consequence, but also important political and institutional consequence. And what we can see here is that a deterioration in this indicator that we have observed since our previous lecture, this indicator of constraints on the executive power. So what we have is an increase um, in a more authoritarian regimes that we see, for instance, in the case of Argentina, the rise of the military dictatorship. Basically, we can summarize that like a deterioration in institutional terms in the year following the depression. In the case of Chile, so we will see the collapse of the parliamentary regime that happened before the Great Depression. But in the particular case of Chile, so Chile was a case where the First World War have an important impact on his exports, because the nitrate basically saw the rise of a competitor. So what happened is that during the First World War, Germany developed the synthetic nitrate that competed with the Chilean one, and that reduced the Chile export capacity. But with difference in timing, so what we will see during this period is essentially an important institutional deterioration and a decline in terms of constraints on the executive. So we have a more authoritarian regimes, at least in this country. So in the case of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. So that didn't happen in all Latin American countries. So what we have is an improvement in the particular case of Colombia, but that was more like one specific case. In the case of Colombia, in the case of Peru, in the case of Venezuela, what happened in Venezuela is that the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez survived the depression, but when that regime ended in the mid-30s, so we see a positive evolution in this measurement of constraints of the executive power. Not in the case of Mexico, so no a major change that could explain, because what we have in practicality in Mexico is a single party regime. So we have that the PRI have the control of that country. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Mexican Revolution occurred before the interwar period and before all this deglobalization process. World War II was a second and probably more important or external shock. I mean, the collapse of the export growth model was reinforced by World War II. So we have a major shock like the Great Depression. So we have an additional major shock like World War II. So that will lead to the final collapse of the export growth model. Something to consider here is the historical context. So basically, at the time of World War II, this country have experiencing 10 years, a decade since the collapse of the export growth model. So for a lot of people, for many many people in the interest groups or in the economic and political elite, the period of accelerated economic growth from the export-led growth era was a distant relative. So it was just a distant memory because they have observed a decade of recovery boosted mainly by internal markets. So the so-called Belle Epoque or the Argentina Belle Epoque was already at this point a distant relative. So we'll see a more managed international trade, even that there was no a complete disruption of international trade. So what we'll see that is that, for instance, the trade with the US will be more negotiated, more managed. That will be the case of these companies that were very important in the mobilization for World War II. Basically, the US established the metal reserve, the ruble reserve, what I mentioned before, the Inter-American Coffee Agreement. And in a more general way, what we will see during World War II is that governments moved into a higher level of protectionism or of interventionism. So we will see an increase in government level of interventionism. Let's see the evolution of the GDP, the agricultural sector, and the industrial sector during the war. And again, what we can see here is that these countries saw an expansion in their GDP during the war. Basically, part of the mobilization for the war have an impact in these economies. But something that we can notice here is that the engine of economic growth was not anymore the agricultural sector. So primary goods were not at the core of the economic expansion in these economies during World War II. What we see here is an important, a substantial growth rate for the industrial sector. So behind this GDP growth, basically what was behind this was the expansion in the industrial sector. So we saw that the agricultural sector only have an impact, for instance, in the case of Colombia, that was because coffee. I mean, the level of industrialization in Colombia was lower than that, for instance, in Argentina. And also in the case of Mexico was the other country when the agricultural sector saw an expansion. But even that in Mexico, the agricultural sector is displaying a positive evolution. We cannot compare that with the evolution of the industrial sector. So basically, the growth behind the economic growth during the war, what you have is essentially outstanding performance in the industrial sector. So that will reinforce the urgency in policymakers to adopt policies oriented to promote industrialization in Latin American economies. Okay, so now let's move to the second part of the lecture. So what will be the theory behind the import-substitution strategy? We usually assume that free trade is positive for economic performance. That is illustrated in this very simple model. Basically, what we have here is a market. So we have the supply curve, the demand curve, and essentially what we can see here is that in international trades, if we have our price, an international price that is lower than a national price, so we have a positive impact because we have a larger number of consumers with access to that good. So we have a reduction in prices, we have lower prices and higher quantities. So if we introduce a tariff, if we introduce a tax over that world price, so what we'll see is higher prices and lower quantities. So that will create a distortion for suppliers. So suppliers will be able to cover this segment, but at higher prices. and we will see a reduction in consumption. So we will create a consumption distortion. So usually this is why protectionism is not a good idea for economists. I mean, in addition to the distortion on consumers, on companies, we can assume that free trade also has some benefits for economies. So that would be like the standard assumption. So basically, if local entrepreneurs face external competition, they could have higher incentive to innovate and to be more competitive. So basically, competition create a pressure to innovate that could be positive for economies under a free trade approach. Also, foreign competition could be a way to limit these economies these companies that are not very competitive. So these more this company that we can class like less competitive could be less keen to enter into the market because they would face external competition. And finally, another reason why free trade could improve the economic situation in a country is because most productive firms could have access to a larger market, because now they can export and they are not limited only to external market, and that could have a positive impact on their efficiencies. Also, there are arguments against free trade. So basically, we will explore three arguments, but mainly these two. So we have that an initial argument to have a more interventionist policy in international trade could be that international trade is usually happens between countries with different relative bargaining power. I mean, the idea is that we cannot compare our economy like the US with our economy, with a small economy, for instance, like Uruguay. So if we have a larger economy, we usually assume that, I mean, let me refrain and put in this term. If we have a small economy, we usually assume that economy is a price taker, so have no an influence on prices. On the contrary, if we have a large economy, that economy have an influence on prices, and the idea is that we will need a strategic approach to international trade, because a larger economy could use the terms of trade in his favor. So if that would be the case, so there is an optimal tariff to mitigate that distortion. Also, we could be interested in protecting a particular industry because the development of that industry could have a positive impact on related industries. So we can have the so-called spillover effect. So maybe if I develop a automobile industry, that have a positive impact on the associated service, on the suppliers, and on general terms that could have that could have a positive impact for the whole economy. And finally, an additional argument to oppose to a complete free trade policy is that industries, firms, usually need times when they are in the early stage of development to achieve a high level of competitiveness. So, because initially companies have no added knowledge of how the industry or how the market works. So they need a time to learn about that. So we have the so-called the learning by doing effect. So basically, you only learn to do an activity after you have some experience. And that would be a reason to protect an infant industry. So we have several precedents of that. So this is not just a theoretical idea. We have a historical precedent here. And one that is quite obvious is the industrial policy in the case of the US in the early stage of the American Republic. So we have the Hamilton reports to the Congress, and there is the very famous document, the Report of Manufacturers, basically where Hamilton made a case to have a more strategic approach to international trade, where he highlighted the relevance of develop a national industry in the case of the US that could compete with the European industry. So this is just a picture of the report of manufacturers. And we have also the case of Germany. So Germany will be, until a certain extent, the inspiration for these economies in the 20th century in Latin America that supported the import-substitution industrialization policy. So what happened in the case of Germany? So Germany was a relatively backward economy in the early 19th century. And throughout the 19th century and in the late 19th century, Germany eventually converged or closed. It didn't fully converge, but closed his income gap with Britain. That was the industrial leader of the world at the time. And in order to close his income gap, Germany implemented an industrial policy where government intervened via, for instance, the financial sector with the universal banking system, or via protectionism in international trade, in order to give German companies these learning by doing this time to 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 implement the learning by doing strategy. And the whole idea is that Germany implemented this industrial policy that allowed his good or exceptional economic performance throughout the 19th century. So we have an historical precedent, and what we have here is a picture of Friedrich List, probably the most influential author of the German historical school of economic thought, that it would have a lot of influence on the Clad school that we made a case in favor of the theory for the import substitution industrialization. So external economies of scale is another important element to consider here. So it's a reason to have a more strategic approach to international trade, not just to follow a free trade approach. So basically, the whole idea about external economy of scale is that the scaling up a given industry has some benefits, not just to that industry that now is more competitive, that now have more possibilities, for instance, to compete at international level and to grow via exports, but also scaling up or having large companies, large firms, have also a positive impact in other sectors, in competitors, in supply, because competitors have more reference, have a positive impact in the labor force, because that could lead to a more high-skilled labor force, and also on suppliers. So the idea is that countries with large companies have more possibilities than these countries with a more fragmented or more or countries would have just a small companies. Okay, so now let's examine an strategic trade policy. So the idea is that the economies of scale is important. So the idea is that only when you have reached a certain level of production, so you have the necessary level of competitiveness to not just to compete on the market, but also to be probably more efficient than the incumbent in a given market. And let's assume that if economy of scales play a role here, so we can have a change in the slope of the supply curve from this standard and very simple economic model, and we have now a negative slope in the supply curve. Basically, what we have is we can see that in this again simple economic model, that basically the average cost is associated with the scale. So basically, the idea is that producers can reduce his prices because if they scale up, if they produce a large quantity level, so they face a lower production cost. So basically, the idea here is that only once you have reached a high level of production, you can supply the market at a more competitive price. So that would be a case why economies of scales led to a welfare improving situation. So the point here is, okay, we know that economies of scales are important, but initial conditions are also important. And the next question that we wanted to answer is, what determines who will dominate an industry? So it could be the case that if you are an established country, or if a country is very well positioned in an industry, that initial conditions prevent the rise of another competitor, even with lower average cost, because that competitor couldn't develop it or couldn't move on this average curve, on this average cost curve. Basically, the potential competitor have no the chance the chance to scale up his production. So without industrial policy, what you have is that an established industry prevent or the initial conditions could work like a deterrent for the development of competitors, and that would be an argument to an industrial policy that give industries the chance to grow via learning by doing. So this, here I elaborate a little bit more on this, but basically the idea is that only when I think that I have here. Let me explain these arguments with this graphic. So basically, the idea is that you have two countries here. So, for instance, things that you have an established country, say the U.S. that is on the red on the red line. So what we have here is the average cost, and we have Latin America. This a potential competitor, but have no the experience, have no the didn't have the chance to scale up his production. So basically, what we have is a market that is dominated by this country. Let's assume that is the US. Even that at that level of production, Latin America could be more competitive. And the reason because Latin America is not in the market is because Latin America didn't have the chance to move from this point, from this initial position, and basically have no the possibility to scale up his production and again growing via learning by doing or via economies of scale. So basically, the idea is that once a player, once a country is well established in an industry, is quite difficult to change that situation, and that would be a reason because you wanted to implement a trade policy different from a fully free trade approach. So, I mean, let me skip all this, but basically, this is just an explanation for what I already mentioned here, that the economies of scales could prevent countries to reach that point where they are more competitive. And now, in this last minute, so let me give you some practical examples of or some evidence that we have to support this idea of learning by doing and economy of scale. So we have a very influential article by Paul Davy that he basically explored the cotton textile mills in Massachusetts in the early 19th century. And he finds that learning by doing increased productivity in the textile industry in this situation in Massachusetts in the early 19th century. And that I mean, learning by doing accounted for almost 80% of the annual productivity growth. So the takeaway here is that in this early stage of industrial development, learning by doing and protecting that industry have a positive impact on productivity in this case. So that is interesting here, and that would be something to probably to discuss in a complete lecture, is that the learning by doing effect disappear after a while. So it seems like that was very important in the early stage, but by the mid-19th century, we will see that learning by doing have not any significant contribution to productivity growth. So we can conclude that even if you implement this strategic trade policy, probably you have a time constraint. So that probably should be implemented, but just for a while. The problem is the political economy behind that, that once industries are protected, so remove all that protection is quite difficult. Let me finish. I will continue in the afternoon, so I will continue the remainder of the lecture in another video, but just let me to finish with this example of external of economies of scale. And we have an interesting example in the mobilization for World War II. So what we have is that the US have not a lot of experience in producing cargo fish ships or for in the mobilization for the war. So this is the famous Liberty ships, and basically the highest level of efficiency in producing these ships that will be used in the Second World War was achieved after several rounds of production. So initially, what we have here is that it took, this is on the right-hand scale, so it took more than 5,000 man-hours to produce a unit of this model of chips. But in the second round, we saw a substantial reduction in the working hours. In the third round, an additional reduction, and after several rounds, after the C7 round, so what we see here is that the Navy yards achieved a higher level of efficiency. So again, so the point is that industry needs time to develop, and learning by doing is important to achieve a higher level of competitiveness in the industrial sector. And that would be a theoretical argument for the import-substitution industrialization policy in the case of Latin America. So I will continue in another video in the late afternoon. Yeah, so sorry for
That's
for
okay. Okay.
didn't finish on time.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. So the first one about the model itself, about learning by doing. Is the learning by doing associated to either more intensive usages of the technique, or is it associated with new technologies being invented?
I mean, it's probably more about the first. Is that because I mean, it could be both. To be fair, but basically, let's assume that you are in the situation of a backward country, so you are not on the technological frontier. So let's assume that we are in that case. So basically, what you are doing is that you learn how to use that technology that already exists in a more efficient way. But of course, like any technology, so that requires time, that requires training. So it's not just straightforward that you can move technology from a country that is on the technological frontier into another country that is far away from that point.
And a common theme across a couple of questions was, why did industrialization work in Asia and did not work in Latin America? This is a theme that we have kind of covered since the beginning of the lectures.
Yeah, I think that I can answer that question with a couple of slides that I have later on the lecture, and is here. So basically, contrasting Asia with Latin America. So that is interesting for the second half of the 20th century. So what we have is the economic miracle, for instance, of that of South Korea, and this is what I wanted to show in these slides. Something important is that you have an industrial policy, but with two different approaches. So Asia is essentially export promotion. So what you have in Asia is that the government intervene in the economy very much via funding, via the financial sector. But at the end of the day, the target, the goal for these countries in Asia was to be competitive in international markets. So the approach was the external sector. In the case of Latin America, the focus was mainly on internal markets. So basically, the target in Latin America was preventing local competitors from the competition that they will face by imports, and have like a more captive internal markets rather than to compete at an international level. And just one thing about Asia is that we have I mean, one problem that we have Latin America in the implementation of the import substitution model would be the high level of distortions that we will face. And what we can see is that the level of distortions was not very different in the decades after World War II. For instance, distortion on the price of capital. What I'm measuring here is that how more costly the access to capital is, because you have all these macroeconomic distortions. But what is interesting here is that when you start to see a difference between Latin America and Asia, it's not in the 60s, but it's more on the 70s. So it seems like something changed in the case of Asia in the approximately in the 1970s. That didn't change in the case of Latin America in the level of economic distortion, and that led Asia to a more competitive industrial sector, and also is the focus, the Asian focus on the export promotion, and Latin America focus on internal markets.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. We have run out of time. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate you being here. And we will see you next Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you very much.